In the midst of the blinding flames, the fearsome beast raised its monstrous head and let out a piercing roar that split the air. 3 blood-red eyes glared viciously, and a huge maw bared sharp teeth ready to tear flesh and bone. Perched against the grim wall, a lone man in a tattered black cloak clutched a knife, his only defense against the nightmare. His scream, guttural, was a primal response to the pure terror that gripped his heart. His eyes, widened with fear, reflected the terror of the looming shadow towering over him. As the sky turned an ominous shade of purple, the man flung himself at the huge creature while it let out a horrible scream. The silhouette of the monster loomed above him, overshadowing the evil against the blood-red background. The man breathed ragged sighs, each one labored, sparks dancing around him, remnants of a world engulfed in conflict. The crescendo of the battle was a horrifying dance of life and death. The horrible face of a man was a few centimeters from the monster's mouth. The air was filled with the smell of danger. Every sound was evidence of a close encounter, a chilling symphony of survival in the face of insurmountable obstacles. But his dagger was plunging straight into the flesh of the creature. In an instant, the expression on the man's face froze into a picture of horror. The fangs of the beast glistened in anticipation, looming over the vulnerable figure of the man. With all its might, the creature tried to close its jaws to bite off the man's arm. But alas, victory was not on its side. The man lay defeated beneath the enormous mass of the beast, which seemed to almost mock at the weight of human defiance. The dominance of the beast was absolutely possible, but the mixture of adrenaline in the blood helped the guy survive this unequal battle. The wind howled mercilessly across the barren wasteland, carrying with it the stench of battle and decay. Amidst the desolation, a lone figure struggled for every breath, its body gasping with effort. He was panting. The knife in his hand was no longer a weapon but a crutch to support the weight of his battered body. Lost in his thoughts, he began to dream of another life in which he would use his power to defeat the creatures, muttering to himself about the possibilities that lay just around the corner. But reality came upon him with a harsh call. "Hey, unawakened!" A stark reminder that he was but a pawn in the game of the higher powers. Looking up, he saw a scene of apocalyptic chaos. Giants clutched at each other in a dance of death, their forms so massive that they seemed to tear the very sky. Amidst this maelstrom of violence, he stood alone, a silent witness that his journey was only beginning in the evisceration of these creatures. His musings were interrupted by a stern voice, sarcastic and cold. "What are you doing? If you are a porter, you must do your job and collect the drops." The words whipped at him, demanding submission and servitude, reminding him that his life did not belong to him. With a meekness born of survival, he bowed his head, stammering to apologize to the faceless authority that commanded his fate. "Yeah, I apologize." His words were swallowed up by the wind, and his submission went unnoticed by all but the vultures circling overhead. As the figure turned away, leaving him alone with the dead men, a final insult sounded over his shoulder. "There you go, you useless bastard carriers." It was an admission of his worthlessness, a rejection that echoed through the empty space, leaving him to ponder his existence in the shadow of the monsters. In an upside-down world where the sky bled and the earth was torn apart by an event known only as the Abyss, he watched the guys leaving. He heard the phrase they shouted in his wake. A curse escaped his lips, a lone word expressing his helplessness before his fate. "Fuck," he muttered, a piercing symphony of frustration brought on by the discovery of the Abyss. An abyss that changed the very fabric of existence. The Abyss was a nightmare made real, a realm where creatures of dark fantasy roamed with malicious intent. It heralded an age when the line between myth and reality was irrevocably blurred, casting shadows of horror across the land. Out of the chaos of this newfound hell rose men with powers beyond reason. These awakened beings commanded the forces that shaped the world, subjecting the elements and laws of nature to their indomitable will. The emergence of these transcendent powers gave rise to a new social order, where the worth of man was no longer measured by character and effort, but by the level of his awakening. It was a world where power was the currency of survival, and those who possessed it stood above the rest. Yet among this hierarchy of prominent men, a simple glowing gem reflected the fate of those who were left behind. The porters, the unawakened. But served as a prelude to the untold trials that lay ahead for those who could not claim the mantle of power. And there he stood, the one who held the jewel, and his voice cut through the darkness. "Not me! I am the porter who carries only the cargo of the awakened," he declared. In a world captivated by the tantalizing power of huge creatures, he remained a relic of the old world, a bearer or just an inferior sort among the survivors of the... From the realization of everything in his mind, there was only one thought, that until he woke up, he would never be able to live as they do. He thought bitterly, wrapped in the grim realization of his fate. But in his hands, he held the fruits of his labor, the spoils that belonged to him alone. Gathering his strength into a fist, he shouted in his wake. "I got it all!" he exclaimed. And for a moment there was a flicker of triumph in his gloomy existence. But his victory was short-lived. A sudden sound brought him back to the stark reality of the world around him. His eyes, dilated with alarm, scoured the horizon for the source of the disturbance, and his heart pounded with anticipation and terror. He surveyed the battlefield, the silence of which was even more deafening than the noise. All around him lay the fallen, motionless as ancient columns, silently bearing witness to the carnage. Kneeling beside his fallen brethren, he felt the full weight of the carnage, the harsh reality that he, among fallen heroes and shattered dreams, remained, weighed heavily on his soul. And then a voice cut through the silence, a disembodied and chilling voice that began to say, "What? You are the last one left." The sky began to shatter like glass, and a huge figure the size of a skyscraper began to descend from it. It was a huge, high-ranking monster, the Osmosis monster. In a shadowy alleyway, his heart raced as a huge creature loomed over him, talking as well. A scream escaped his lips, and he fell backwards, and the fabric of reality seemed to tear at the edges. Huge hands began to reach for him, getting closer and closer to his body. The monsters made a slight arm movement, and in a moment, the dagger guy's arm, just like a Lego piece, fell off his body. His eyes widened with horror. He tried to mentally squeeze the hand, but it harmlessly flew away. He fell to the ground with a clatter, his breath caught. He gasped, and his mind was spinning. What kind of... The thought remained unfinished. His body gradually began to grow heavier. Then, a huge purple ray slammed into his head and began to lift his body. Above him towered the embodiment of his nightmare, a horned ghost shrouded in darkness and swirling power, its figure obscuring the twilight sky, and his body gradually began to levitate. He looked up with his last strength at the incorporeal figure floating in front of him, and its light contrasted sharply with the darkness completely embedded in his head. It seemed to be one with him already. Panic gripped him as the viscous darkness began to drip over him, a palpable shadow of the despair that permeated his existence. It clung to his skin, and tears began to flow from his eyes. He tried his best to fight it. Memories cascaded before his eyes. The tragic death of his parents, the stinging laughter of his peers, the crushing weight of being overlooked, unrecognized. Every moment of his life was before him, everything that had brought about the events that were happening to him now. But as he stood there, enveloped in a ghostly glow, he was overcome with resignation. "Is this how I die?" he pondered, a life spent as a mere footnote, a courier of the commonplace, never comprehending the greatness that eluded him. And then, as if in spite of his despondency, a sudden burst of blue energy swept over him. "Awakening!" His body began to fill with power. He began to clench his teeth to fight it all, while blood continued to flow down his cheeks. Suddenly a voice began to sound in his head that said, "All the conditions for awakening have been met," echoed the universe, or was it his state before he died? He stood on the threshold of the unknown, his gaze fixed on the tantalizing staircase of heaven. Above him appeared a being radiating a pure radiance, like a guide among the stars, and his heart raced with the anticipation of a journey beyond the earthly plane. A look of incomprehension and a barely audible whisper escaped his lips against the backdrop of outer space. The figure above his head shimmered with an otherworldly light, a silent sentinel watching him. The glowing guide with hair like streams of stardust was both a beacon and a mystery, a presence that defied comprehension and yet seemed deeply familiar, as if answering a call from deep within him. Perhaps he had fallen into purgatory? He turned back and said, "What? I'm definitely..." His thoughts were a jumbled mess. the utter impossibility of the situation struggling against the hard evidence of his feelings. There was no denying the profound change that had taken place in him. Suddenly the darkness stirred, and then the creature named Asmodeus hung in the air. Precisely the ghost from the abyss that had just drawn his energy began to disintegrate into particles. The figure that was in the background of the guy mocked his attention to such a trivial thing as stopping Asmodeus. The real spectacle was not the cessation, but the beginning, the dawn of a power beyond the previous fears and adversaries. He turned toward this unknown and asked, Who are you?" Awe and reverence could be heard in his voice. He sat humbly before the figure, searching for the truth behind the appearance that announced his transformation, a truth that promised to unravel the very fabric of his being and create it anew. An unknown person began to say that some call me king, and his voice echoed through the void, as if the title were a mere footnote in his existence. Seated among the stars, the creature proclaimed a gift of power to Guy, whose knees were chained to the stardust. A gift? A burden? He didn't understand what was going on. Just a few minutes ago, his body was being drained of energy, and now he was being told about the gift. His thoughts raced, trying to make sense of the reality of kings and power. The whirlwind of thoughts collided with every word spoken, leaving him adrift in a sea of bewilderment. The connection to Asmodeus, the power he felt, seemed to bind him to this cosmic monarch in some unfathomable way. Untrustworthy? Asmodeus thought. Caution echoed in the creature's tone. Guy was very much frightened by this. Could he really hear his thoughts? And then, making a statement that seemed to resound in the very core of his being, the Celestial King recognized the qualities that had attracted him to Guy, evidence of his indomitable will. In an instant, the cosmos swept through him. Galaxies and nebulae swirled in his soul. Something began to happen around him. A huge stream of energy was directed at him. A huge beam of light began to emanate from the deity. The guy started screaming without realizing what was going on. All he could say was why he was chosen, what made him so special. He didn't understand what was going on, and the deity said that the day would come when he would understand. But for now, he had to do what he hadn't finished. He's coming back. The lights began to go out, and the last thing the creature managed to add was that their meeting was not the last, and they would meet again very soon. Awakening. The guy started to open his eyes from someone shouting good morning to him and shaking him like a sack of garbage. Full awakening after being punched in the face by an unknown person. The blow was so strong that Guy forgot about the events that had just happened to him. It was just a blow as invigorating as coffee in the morning. His consciousness was still clouded with sleep, but in his voice sounded an urgent request to bring him back to reality. But the question of whether he was awake all came to him, as well as the blows to his face. Started to fall as a heavy weight pressed him to the ground, but the guy grabbed him. With a smirk that didn't reach his eyes, leaned over him and said, "Boy, you only listen when you're beaten." When Jay oriented himself, he recognized the familiar setting of the school cafeteria, now empty and humming. His heart clenched when he saw the unmistakable figure of his school enemy, Tae-hyung, laughing with another former classmate at the other end of the hall. Memories of bullying and helplessness came over him, and incredulously he muttered, "How is that bastard who bullied me at school here now?" The encounter was not accidental. It was orchestrated by Tae-hyung, who had cornered him that same day, asserting his authority as he had in the past. Many emotions were reflected on him: shock, fear, and echoes of former resilience. But where did these feelings come from in him? When he lifted his head, the midday sun came through the high windows and poured down on the silhouette of those bullies who were so eager to deal with him here and now. When Jay's gaze fell on the blood-red, paint-splattered revelation of Kim Tae-hyun, 19 years old, rank F, that was the name of our protagonist, and these were his characteristics. A flood of thoughts ran through Kim's mind, and with ghostly clarity everything fell into place. "Since that's the case, then," he muttered to himself, and a grim smile pulled the corners of his mouth taut as it dawned on him what time he had been transported to. His laughter started out as a whisper, but quickly escalated into an actual manic explosion. The sound filled the empty space, becoming a defense mechanism against the terror that threatened to consume him, a rebellion against the fear Tae-hyung had instilled in him for so long. The onlookers, including Tae-hyung and his companions, stared in bewilderment at what was happening. What's wrong with him? Is he crazy?" Concern and mockery could be heard in their voices. But Kim's laughter did not subside. It was his battle cry against the tyranny of his past. Daehyun's face contorted with rage at the sight of his victim's sudden defiance. "You bastard! You really want a flogging," he growled, stepping forward with a menacing glare. But Kim was ready. As his fist rushed toward him, he delivered a lightning-fast punch with a dexterity born of years. The air around him crackled with the tension of the moment, a dance of shadows and light as he finally confronted his tormentor. It wasn't just a duel. It was the breaking of the chains that had bound him for far too long. The schoolyard turned into a battlefield, with Kim at the center of it, extending his fist in a powerful punch that sent Hyuk-soo rolling on the ground. The action was a swift blur of motion that was accompanied by a sharp other attackers clearly did not expect such a development. When Hyuk-soo regained consciousness, Kim's facial features contorted into a sly, knowing smile. "So, I am too," he whispered, the realization coming to him like a predator realizing its fangs. He had always been roughed up, but now the situation was different. He stood to his full height, his posture firm, and his eyes burning with fierce determination. A light seemed to shine from behind his back, turning him into the protagonist of his own story, as it were. No longer a minor character in Daehyun's oppressive narrative. Taehyung's voice cut through the charged air, a mixture of disbelief and rage. "Kim! Are you bastard out of your mind? You fucking nobody!" His words should have hurt, but Kim was already beyond them, beyond the reach of Taehyung's scorn. The collision that followed was electric. Literally. Streaks of light enveloped Kim and his opponent, the energy of the fight felt by all who watched. The confrontation went beyond a simple fistfight. It was a clash of wills, a struggle for identity. And then, in the midst of this chaos, Kim's fist appeared, enveloped in a swirl of electric arcs, a clear indication of his new power. The air crackled with the tension of the eventual impact, the moment before the storm. It was the incredible power of the blow that lurked in his hands. The air crackled as Taehyung's body flew away from the boa constrictor, his arms becoming a whirlwind of released energy. Kim stood unwavering, years of hidden struggle reflected in his eyes. 35 years, the words hung in the air, a testament to the silent battles he had fought while the world saw only a sleeping figure. All my unawakened life, I've done my best, Kim thought, making a silent vow that strengthened his will to face the storm. His journey was a montage of relentless training, shining his disciplined body against the nightmarish creatures that had haunted him in the past. From fundamental physical training to mastering a vast knowledge of the abyss and its monsters, Kim turned himself into a weapon. Boxing gloves pounded the bag, arrows split the air. Each repetition was a step away from the label of unawakened that had been placed on him. The training was hard, endless, but Kim came out hardened and ready. Now, in the throes of battle, Kim's voice cut through the chaos, declaring his newfound strength. "So there's no way I'm losing to you," he shouted, and his voice became a spear against Taehyung's attack. The air around them became a storm of movement, each movement a blow of survival and defiance. The battle reached its climax, and both warriors were locked in a gravitational moment of truth. Taehyun and Kim, opponents bound by fate, were now but a blur, a symphony of blows and parries that could end in an instant. Taehyun's body fell to the ground, raising a storm of dust as Kim's lightning-fast punches seemed to have gotten the adrenaline in his blood, and he was taking advantage of it. Kim's lips parted, a hesitant, "Sure," came out of them, and he resigned himself to the challenge ahead. He was ready to finish this fight. Tension was building up, Kim's patience was breaking, his voice becoming harsh like broken glass. "What nonsense!" His strength had waited so long for the opportunity to break free, and now he was finally fully in control of his body. A confrontation was inevitable, and he met his gaze with his opponent, the air thick with anticipation. "What? Awakened?" he asked, disbelief turning to rage. Taehyun, the cause of his confusion, held himself defiantly, and his contemptuous words fueled the fire inside Kim. In a crescendo of rage and power, Taehyung changed his appearance, a metamorphosis heralded by the chorus of the setting sun. Clad in crystalline armor, he became the embodiment of vengeance. "Now you're dead!" he roared, and his voice was a harbinger of the storm to come. With his stone arm, he started to strike towards Kim, but the latter was able to get back from him. He was completely on the same wavelength with his body, so it was no problem. All the punches were just a lazy movement on his opponent's part. Kim knew where he was going to hit, and could easily dodge them by just moving his body into the right position. Taehyun couldn't take it anymore, so he decided to pounce on Kim with a lightning-fast punch right from the top. Jumping above him, he flew at Kim. The impact was so powerful that it couldn't even compare to an earthquake. The ground in the schoolyard was shaking from the epicness of the moment. The end? Kim could not withstand such an attack from his opponent. His silhouette began to be seen among the dust flying. Kim began his attack. Before his opponent can see anything, he comes at him from behind, trying to land the same blow. But the enemy notices him and turns to him. Kim was thrown back, and the force of the invisible blow drew lines of shock across his face. The once impenetrable shell around him cracked, the web of defeat spreading with each agonizing second. How could this be? He had created a shield directly from his body. Drops of blood began to ooze from Kim's hands. With a swiftness born of desperation, Kim lunged at him. "What are you doing?" asked Taehyung. It wasn't just a question, it was a battle cry, a declaration that he wouldn't give up without a fight. His armored fist, as an extension of his will, cleaved the air with deadly intent. From above, the fight looked almost balletic, a dance of light and shadow as Kim's body curled and unfurled in a symphony of aggression. Each of his punches was a promise, a vow to stand his ground, and his face was a mask of determination and rage. He tried with his whole body to block the blows of that rock. Kim soared into the air and flew away from his opponent. The world around them exploded into chaos, debris and energy swirling in a whirlwind of conflict. It was a moment of truth, when wills collided, and only one could emerge victorious, his fate written in the storm of their battle. On the field of the schoolyard from such a blow, his body stretched for several kilometers. It was a very strong and powerful blow, which even Kim himself did not expect. Among the debris of the asphalt he lay bleeding. His body was broken, but it did not stop him to fight for life. He had only recently felt the power of his body, and now it was over. Taehyun continued to be covered in rocky growths. He was building up more and more strength with each passing second to finish this fight with Kim already. He said it was time for Kim to think about running away instead of trying to fight him, getting closer to Kim with each step to finally finish this fight. His enemy's mocking words hung in the air, questioning his ability to wield the newly awakened power within him. Despite the heat of the flames and the weight of despair, a spark of determination flashed in Kim's eyes. He was more than a warrior. He possessed a skill and rank known only to a few. For Kimi was S-ranked in his abilities, a creature whose mere presence blurred the boundaries between humans and the monsters of legend. With each breath her power grew, her mastery of the elements awe-inspiring. A sudden epiphany came over him, a realization that could change the course of their intertwined destinies. The narrative whispered of an unforeseen connection, a shared fate that neither of them could have predicted. That deity that gave him a second chance to change his story. In the silence before the storm, Taehyung realized something was wrong. Tension was in the air, the sky colored with the hues of an impending conflagration. His enemy had been defeated but not vanquished, and the taunts fueled a fire in Kim. Kim rose, and his silhouette cut through the chaos. Power bubbled in his veins, an aura of defiance hovered around him. He declared to the world, and maybe even to himself, saying, "I don't feel like I'm going to lose." His voice was a whisper amidst the rumble of battle, but there was an unwavering determination in it. From beneath the rubble, an old friend watched the scene with disbelief. Taehyung's eyes widened as he witnessed the impossible. Taehyun, who was underestimated by everyone, was being transformed using a power that was legendary. "It can't be! You've really awakened?" exclaimed Taehyun. At that moment, the world shifted on its axis. The hierarchy that was controlling the situation at that moment was collapsing, and at the center of the cause was Kim's awakening. He found himself in the center of an incomprehensible transformation. Dark threads were winding around him, a manifestation of the unbridled power he had unwittingly touched. "Is this predation?" he asked, and his voice pierced like an arrow through the tense air of the battlefield air. Confusion clouded his senses as he tried to comprehend the sudden surge of magic that answered his call. "I don't know what's going on." Kim's plea echoed in the void, the words dissipating as quickly as they formed. The newfound power was itself a living thing, wild and unbridled. A shadow loomed over him, the silhouette of his opponent silhouetted against the chaos. In a cold and determined voice, his adversary swore, But it will all end when I kill you. The threat cut through the turmoil, becoming a vivid reminder that the battle was on. Kim's hand reached for the conductor of the raging energy he wanted to master. His will became the rudder controlling the turbulent sea of magic, directing all of his body's energy toward the enemy. In a burst of willpower and magic, Kim channeled his essence into the heart of the enemy's darkness. The energies collided with a brilliance that tore apart the battlefield, a single moment of purity amidst the chaos. Everyone's powers were at maximum capacity. In the midst of the battle, Kim's opponent was caught off guard. His grin turned into a stunned exclamation of disbelief. "What?" The word escaped his lips as Kim's released energy met its target. A pulsating sphere of light appeared between them. With a steely gaze, Kim directed the chaotic energy at his opponent, stretching out his arm as if he wanted to reach the very soul of the conflict. The air around him crackled, and the ground beneath him shook with the force of his resolve. As the power poured from Kim's palm, the world seemed to pause, holding its breath as the raw energy danced and wriggled at his command. A mask of concentration appeared on Kim's face, streaked with lines of effort and the weight of determination. His opponent reeled under the blow, a scream erupting from him as the energy found its victim. His figure crackled with the impact, the force of Kai's attack becoming a visible wave that threatened to overwhelm him. And then, with a final desperate cry, the antagonist's resistance collapsed, his figure swallowed by the inexorable flow of Kim's power. There was a battle cry in which both the victory and the pain of defeat resounded. The energy Kim commanded had decided the fate of the conflict. At this time in the school, everyone was enjoying the serene end of the day from the window of their classroom, filled with the laughter of youth. The peace of the moment was shattered in an instant. The room turned into chaos, a whirlwind of power and fury that shattered papers and bent the steel frames of their shelter. Outside the window, the apocalypse was simply going on. Kim stood at the center of the storm, his body a conduit for the wild energy surging through him. His eyes dilated with the shock of the power released. A figure emerged among the settling dust, half hidden by shadow, the remnants of the battle clinging to it like a shroud. A trickle of smoke escaped its lips, the last gasp of the enemy's breath. Then, when the battle was won and the predator complete, Taehyung collapsed, his strength exhausted and his spirit as shattered as he was, lying in ruins around him. The light of the setting sun enveloped him in a warm embrace, a stark contrast to the cold silence that filled the schoolyard. This was the final point in their struggle. Kim found himself in a world with mysterious forces where actions have immediate and tangible consequences. After an encounter that tested him, he experienced a tangible transformation. His rank rose to a new level, marked by a message that appeared before him as a sentence from the unknown world. His body felt the weight of the new power flowing through him, and the transformation was both thrilling and terrifying. His arm was the first to succumb to the change, to crumble, exposing the glowing essence beneath the surface. He absorbed the powers of his enemy. Meanwhile, in a more mundane corner of this reality, a woman sat at her desk, her normal surroundings in stark contrast to the chaos that engulfed Kim. Her smile was oblivious to all that was happening. Kim carried the bodies of her enemies into her office, carrying all the bodies. Her shock at his sudden appearance was obvious. Her workday had been disrupted by an unexpected crisis. "Hello, teacher," he managed to utter in a barely audible whisper. There was a deep respect in his address, or perhaps a last plea for a clue in a world that had become unrecognizable. The woman's reaction was a scream, a reaction to the impossible scene before her. Her scream was not just a cry of fear, but a confrontation with a reality that could not be explained. After the underground battle, Taehyun was one of those who took the brunt of the chaos. He lay motionless in the sterile environment of the school clinic, his wounds silently testifying to the violence he had endured. Once the enemies were safely in the hospital, including Taehyung, the healer's touch was the only thing standing between Kim and the lingering pain of his injuries. The nurse's hands, glowing with an ethereal radiance, danced over his bruises, binding the flesh with a skill bordering on miraculous. But even as the physical wounds closed, a web of lies was woven around the truth of what had happened. Kim answered the nurse's inquiries readily, making up half-truths designed to shield her from the grim realities of their world. The latter, a common threat, had become a scapegoat for injuries that were far from accidental. When Kim, healed, stepped out into the daylight, The severity of his injuries had subsided, leaving behind his newfound strength. He walked with quiet triumph, avenged and reawakened from his new absorption. But beneath the surface of his contentment lurked a problem, a shadow that followed his every step, hinting at trouble to come and a far from over battle. For his goal is more global than just a schoolyard battle. But his journey was just beginning, and he was ready for battle at any cost. So it was too early to give up or think he was a hero after one battle. In the midst of this chaos, like a banner in the wind, the truth unfolded. The rank he had spent his entire life to rise to had risen as a result of a single, decisive battle. He had been given the rank of F, a label unsuitable for the power he possessed, which rivaled that of those who occupied a much higher position in the echelon of power. His every being pulsed with an energy that did not match his status, and he stood at the crossroads of his destiny, and the echoes of battle reverberated in his core. For his powers were at the minimum rank of C. Questions haunted him as he climbed the stairs that had witnessed countless departures and returns. The mystery of King, the elusive figure who had granted him this power and simultaneously cursed him with regression, was an enigma hovering in the shadows of his mind. A determination froze in him, a silent vow that he must walk this path. A clarity of purpose appeared, the one task that demanded his attention above all else. With each step his determination grew, and his gaze was fixed on the building that towered above him, the silent guardian of his silent oath. When Kim returned to the place he once called home, he was greeted by nostalgic whispers of a past life. The absence had been long, the journey difficult, but the memories of home brought a quiet comfort to his weary soul. Yet in the warm embrace of nostalgia lurked the specter of loss, the memory of his parents, whose departure left a void that no victory could fill. With his uncle as his guardian, Kim found a semblance of family amidst the turmoil. In the dim light of the landing, Kim's footsteps echoed sharply, staccato in the night silence. He had just received a message. His uncle's train was delayed, and he would be home late. The silence that filled the house was a sharp contrast to the familiar warmth that greeted Kim every evening. Halfway up the stairs, Kim was stopped by a sudden noise, a muffled thumping coming from the floor above. His heart pounded in his ears, fear and adrenaline rushed through his veins, and Kim froze in place, feeling the danger alarms running down the back of his neck. In the dimly lit room where the tension hangs, 3 figures dressed in dark clothing loomed over a fourth, prostrate on the wooden floor. Unspoken threats hovered in the room. The masked faces were impersonal and cold. The one lying on the floor was picking up money scattered on the floor. A few bars passed, and among the assailants the face of the youngest for a moment lighted up with recognition. "Kim," he said with disbelief in his voice. The sound of his own name seemed to jolt the captive, and fear was replaced for a moment by surprise. It was a story, unspoken but palpable. His gaze was fixed on the young man who was supposed to be at the school, and a question hung in the air, laden with worry. "Huang Jae-young, why aren't you at school?" Each episode was a piece of the puzzle, and together they added up to the picture that this was a robbery. A late train set things in motion, and Kim witnessed the scenes of intimidation and his brother being victimized by these events. A sea of past and present raged in his mind. Memories of the man they called the ringleader, of him and the other hooligans rushing through the streets with a grin on their lips, taking whatever they wanted without regard for the consequences. Even before Kim had inexplicably found himself thrown back in time, a phenomenon that still haunted him to this day, he remembered the havoc the ringleader had wreaked, the fear he had instilled. Now that the Kolzenozer's grip tightened around his neck, Kim's vision blurred, the line between past and present wavering. The words that had hung in the air, "To think it would happen today," hung in the air like a prophecy come true, like a moment expected and feared. The ringleader's thugs formed a menacing circle around them, their faces obscured by the dim light, but their intentions were as clear as day. Kim, the ringleader, stood on the threshold with eyes widened with surprise. "Wow," he exclaimed with a misplaced levity not befitting the gravity of the situation. "I was wondering who it was, and it's Jay's cousin." That connection should have been comforting, but in the cold, hard reality of the ringleader's stronghold, it only drove the knife of betrayal deeper. The ringleader's angry voice interrupted Kim's thoughts. The ringleader said that if you didn't want to get beaten up, don't interfere and just walk on by. His words a clear warning to Kim. Kim could feel the heat of his breath, the certainty that they would take what they wanted and leave nothing but rubble behind. But when the leader leaned toward him and curled his lips in a grin as he said, "Unawakened Kim," something inside Kim changed. It was as if the very words with which he was to be belittled had ignited his resolve. Kim met the ringleader's gaze and his eyes hardened with newfound purpose. "Perfect," he whispered, not to the ringleader but to himself, a perfect way to absorb his powers as well. Kim's heart pounded in his chest like a drum, and the words struggled to come off his lips. "I wanted to test him." The headman's eyes narrowed, confusion appeared on his face, and immediately the room was filled with the sound of crackling energy. At the flick of Kim's wrist, there was a palpable shockwave, and the force of its unspoken power tossed the ringleader into the air. The huge hulk flew like a weightless marionette plucked from its strings, then collapsed downward with a thunderous "Kyak!" The headman's minions froze, their postures frozen in bewilderment. A collective sigh filled the room, their facial expressions changing from shock to fear. Kim stood, breathing steady, eyes burning with newfound determination. With another jerk of will, he sent another attacker flying. The room became a solid blur, the bandits on the defensive, their confidence shattered by the unexpected display of strength. The ringleader, wide-eyed and disoriented from the impact, managed to shout a desperate, "Please!" His voice, previously full of threat, was now trembling with panic. But it was too late. The situation had changed, and Kim was no longer the victim, but the hunter. In a matter of moments, the balance of power had shifted. Kim's abilities, an unbridled flow of energy, awakened in full force, responding to his commands with furious fury. The bandits, once formidable predators, became prey at their own game. The ringleader's screams were swallowed up by the emptiness of defeat. His reign ended not by a rival gang, but by a single man, a boy who had entered his power, a power they had neither expected nor been able to counter. With a final, swift movement, Kim brought the ringleader to his knees, and the floorboards creaked under the weight of defeat. They clearly hadn't expected the guy they thought had undiscovered his talent to have such power. Kim's breath was hazy in the cold air of the room, his brow furrowed in concentration. With a silent invocation, he reached for the power he called predation. But the dark void within him offered no answer, and the function he had so desperately sought was now only an echoing silence in his mind. The blackened words seemed to laugh at him from the void. The function predactus is unavailable. Recovering from the shock, the ringleader could only mumble confusedly, "What?" It seemed that the air itself was buzzing with the tension of unasked questions, the struggle for power hanging in the balance. Predation. Not activated? A whisper of disbelief could be heard in Kim's voice. His outstretched hands were empty as the promises of power he thought he possessed. Cold sweat protruded on his forehead as the realization came that he was now as vulnerable as everyone else. "You!" The word escaped the other bandit's lips like a dagger aimed at an unseen foe, or perhaps the betrayal of his own body. His eyes were wide open, irises trembling with the horror of betrayal and the shock of vulnerability. As the blow flew at him, he paid no attention to it. The bandit, sensing the change, seized the moment. His voice boomed across the room. "Crazy bastard!" It was a declaration of war, a signal to his minions that the time for talking was over. The violence that followed was brutal and swift. Kim was thrown backwards. The world turned into a solid blur of pain and light as he screamed. The walls, ceiling, and floor seemed to spin. He was tossed about like a leaf in the wind. The ringleader towered over him, his minions flanking him, their faces a mask of rage and triumph. He roared, and his voice sounded like the tolling of a bell heralding the end. The word was a sentence of death, a final judgment pronounced without mercy, as intricate light glyphs erupted from the masked fighter's hands. The power known as Bind, elsewhere, beneath a sinister purple shroud, the warrior summoned the essence of poison. From hands that whispered death, shadows danced around, obeying the summoner's will. In another corner, a figure stood guard, its aura serving as a shield against the darkness. The power bleed burst from its core, a bright cascade of poisonous energy seeking out the life force of the enemy. At the node of conflict, warriors harnessed the fury of the elements. Once at the epicenter of the storm, they channeled the power that speaks of beginnings and ends, the power that shapes worlds and destroys them directly into Kim. And in the silence, amidst the echoes of spent strength and the memory of battles fought, stood two figures locked in silent confrontation. Words, sharp as daggers, hung between them like a challenge and a gauntlet. How dare the unawakened pretend to be awakened? The accusation cut deeper than any physical wound, calling into question Kim's very essence and existence. Kim's silhouette began to appear amongst the misty haze. Surprisingly, they didn't expect him to be able to stand. So they thought it was just an echo of his spirit. Nothing more. But it wasn't. Kim was covering his face from the dust that had risen after that powerful blow to his side, and it was not very obvious that he was injured or scratched by those powerful blows to his side. With a smirk on his face, he said that it was an excellent attempt to impress him, but they did not appreciate it to the point of believing him to be unawakened. The bandits look at him and don't understand how this is possible, because no one would be able to withstand the power of 3 T's-ranked blows, and Kim stands there without a single damage. At the same moment, while the enemies were wondering what they had done wrong, Kim decided to take revenge and threw himself directly at his enemies, hitting the first bandit with a crushing blow right in the chest. Kim's lone figure stood amidst the storm, a faint smile playing on his lips and his eyes glowing with newfound strength. It was strong, this power that flowed within him, strong enough to change the course of the battle, strong enough to make him question the limits of his own strength. With light streaming through the curtains of the old room, Kim stood over his defeated opponent, the weight of decision still hanging in the air. Slowly shoving his hands into his pockets, he looked over the result with quiet satisfaction. The fight was over, but the calm in his eyes was no match for the storm that had raged only moments before. Reflecting on what had happened, the warrior put on a contemplative look. "I guess I've learned 2 things, huh?" he pondered to himself. The victories of this bout were twofold: fighting and wisdom. Each fight, each victory, were teachers, and he, the diligent student, was learning their lessons. But there was more to the lessons of this battle than just victories and defeats. One of the skills hidden in his arsenal revealed its deeper nature, a passive effect veiled in mystery, unmarked in any folio or scroll. Besides, he realized, the passive effect of the Predator skill is not mentioned in the skill description. Returning to the silence, Kim pondered his next steps. Well, gradually I'll be able to confirm the correctness of my assumptions, he thought, narrowing his eyes with the precision of a hawk. The road ahead was paved with caution and strategy, where every step was measured against the unknown potential of his power. And so, oblivious to the world around him, the warrior set out on a journey inside himself, seeking to understand the depth of his capabilities. Each discovery brought him closer to the truth that only he was to discover, and only he could utilize it. In the dim light of the room, the heavy air was pierced by the sharp crack of a voice. "What are you doing?" It hung over the scene like a storm cloud about to burst. On the floor, bent low, lay his brother, his forehead pressed against the wood in a deep bow that spoke of despair. Above him loomed Kim's silhouette, untouched by the force of gravity. The room seemed to shrink around brother as he raised his head, his face contorted in panic. Sweat trickled down his forehead and he stammered his confession, fear and hope in his voice. He was like a man who saw an abyss in front of him and grasped for a lifeline. "I, Huang Jia-young, your cousin, your..." His pleas turned into a wild promise of bondage, of shameless self-abasement. "Whether it's boot-licking or dog barking, I'll do whatever you tell me to do." The words fell haphazardly from his lips, each syllable hitting his dignity, his hands clenched into fists as if in prayer to a ruthless deity. But the Kim to whom he addressed his pleas, Hyung Nim, was in sharp contrast to Kim's crumpled figure. There was a coldness in his eyes as he looked at the humiliated man, and a certain distance that no amount of pleading could overcome. Knowledge of the brother's nature flashed through his thoughts, the realization that cunning, once useful, was now despised. I knew even then that the fellow was a bloody fox, but who knew he was so bad? But Kim realized that the problem now was not his brother's humiliation, but that there was a more important threat than these thieves, that the attack was nothing compared to what the world was facing. And the world is on the brink of doom. Amid the shadows of regret and the fading echoes of desperate vows, the true story was just beginning to unfold. So Kim said he was willing to take him along and teach him all he could. His brother was as glad as a dog's bone. He also added to follow him and be an obedient boy. There was an irony to all these events in his words. But he realized that this would be the responsibility of a new identity, not just a walk with a friend. At this time, we are transported to a long-abandoned factory. This factory has long been considered out of business, so entry to it is strictly forbidden to all. But the sign with the inscription that entrance to outsiders is forbidden, and only a limited number of people have access said something different, that something lurks behind this fence. In one of the blocks stood 3 people in suits. On them shone a bright light, given that it was already evening. The light came from some artificial source, and from their facial expressions you could tell that they were madly surprised at what was in front of them. In front of them was a huge magic field net that tried to contain the influx of huge monsters. But there was only one question in the air. Could this net withstand such a large influx of creatures or not? One of the men looked and assured that the years of development of this system could easily withstand such an influx, and that there was no need to worry and panic unnecessarily. It made no sense in this situation. But the other scientists were obviously not so sure, because they knew what kind of force such an influx could withstand. But the chief scientist did not hear anyone, and all the shouting was nothing to him. He turned around and said, "My level B skill has created the strongest defense, and critters like the ones behind this grid don't even have a rank F+ to worry about them breaking through. And that the maximum rank that could even be encountered there was rank C. So even in the worst case scenario, it would only be able to slightly damage the dome, but not break it. He'll recover quickly." However, while the scientist was talking, something went obviously not according to plan. His praised dome began to crack, and from the other side began to come out all the creatures that so contained this dome. The creatures that the scientist had just considered to be nothing, broke through all of his praised defenses, and began to fill the space of the factory gradually, in search of their first victims. Scattering particles of the dome showered the scientist. He obviously did not expect that this could happen at all. So while he was thrown back from the explosion, he tried to catch himself thinking where he had made a mistake. By this time, Kim and his brother were on their way. Kim remembered that day, and knew he had only seconds left before the crash and apocalypse. His brother was trying to find out where they were running so fast and what was going on. And he was also wondering what was Kim's strength, what was the rush. But Kim didn't give any comments on that, and just ran. He had to make it in time. He had to do it. Kim said that even though he has a low rank, he possesses C-rank powers, which makes him stronger than others think, and his advantage is that everyone thinks that he has discovered his abilities. His brother was completely shocked at the answer, because he couldn't understand how this could be. All of Kim's words were contradictory to reality. Could such a thing even be possible? But at this time, he realized that he really thought that his brother had not found his talent. And here he was able to withstand an influx of huge and powerful bandits. So he's not lying and he's telling the truth. At this time, the factory was already in chaos. Many of the scientists were ruthlessly killed. Because of the mistake of one man who thought he was smarter than others, and no one could resist him in his power. This hero himself stood and tried to come to his senses to begin to understand what was going on. The only question he was concerned about at that moment was how the low-ranked creatures were able to break through his defenses. When the dust settled, the scientist stood before him in bewilderment, her eyes reflecting the pandemonium that had unfolded before her. "This can't be," he whispered, the words barely escaping his lips. The air around him pulsed with an invisible force, a flow of mana so powerful that it seemed to ripple through the very fabric of reality. "Is the mana overflowing from here above my rank?" he thought with awe, and his face reflected fear and delight. The silence was broken by a voice full of panic. "Commander!" came a shout that broke through the confusion. A figure in the background gestured frantically towards the epicenter of the chaos. "Something inside the gate!" The phrase was left unfinished, but the meaning was clear. They were not alone, and the unknown loomed over them. A creature appeared from the depths of the shimmering gate, its maw open in a soundless snarl, and its eyes a pair of soulless voids. The energy around it crackled with greed. The air hummed with the anticipation of destruction. The very presence of this creature was an insult, a challenge to the laws of nature. New monsters of gigantic proportions materialized above them, their auras filled with a malevolent glow. The largest of them towered above the rest, a colossus of muscle and malice, a king among nightmares. It was a legion of horrors, each one a harbinger of doom. The group commander, who had become a small island in the midst of a sea of monsters, stood still. His mind raced with thoughts of the army of creatures that had burst through the gates, each one radiating a thirst for chaos. The stench of menace hung in the air, and the silence foreshadowed the cacophony of battle that was sure to follow. At that terrifying moment, as the shadows of the beasts loomed over him, the group commander realized that the real test had arrived. The struggle for survival was about to begin, and the fate of all would depend on saving them or a battle to the death. In the crumbling ruins of a once vibrant factory, a creature from nightmares appeared, its huge figure casting shadows across the broken streets. Glowing red eyes pierced the twilight, and a roar that seemed to shake the very earth reverberated through the air, sending chills down the spine of anyone unlucky enough to hear it. Crystals hung ominously around him, catching the last light of day, and an ominous aura emanated from them. The scientist stood unmoving. His eyes were widened with fear. His lips parted in a low whisper, perhaps uttering a name or a plea, but it was cut short by a realization that struck him like a lightning strike. "It wasn't..." He gasped, and the truth came upon him with the force of a sledgehammer. This couldn't be. How did it even happen that they had explored everything and never encountered monsters of such a high rank in these years? The years of research just collapsed like a dome under the pressure of the monsters. Amidst the panic, a voice came out, clear and strong despite the chaos. "Young, let's say you're right." It was the voice of reason, an acknowledgement of the rightness expressed in the heat of an argument, a recognition that perhaps the situation was indeed as dire as one feared. At this time, Kim and his brother were already approaching the scene. "But this is ridiculous! How the hell do you know all this?" shouted his brother, his voice echoing off the walls. The answer came quickly and confidently, a note of memory in his voice. "Because I've been through this before." It was a testament to past experiences that Kim had been through before. Suspicion crept into his mind as his brother thought about those words, and a light of doubt lit up in his eyes. Intuition. "Ah?" they asked, skeptical of their interlocutor's assertions, and the word hung between them like a glove thrown down in defiance. The confrontation quickly escalated, and accusations were sprinkled. There were tears in the eyes of the friar, who had stood firm, and conviction and despair in his voice. "My intuition says it's true. You're lying." It was a cry of betrayal, a statement that broke through the pretense and hit the walls of deception hard. But the truth, as is so often the case, made itself known in the most appalling manner. A horde of monstrous creatures descended upon the fleeing crowd, their faces contorted with horror. "Don't tell me you're trying to deceive me," one of them shouted, realizing that he was facing a nightmare far worse than any deception. Amidst the chaos that engulfed the city, the brother stood stunned, a stream of questions swarming in his mind, unvoiced and formless, presented as a cloud of question marks that seemed almost tangible above his head. Hyunsu, known in his ranks as the Blade of Lunaticism, stood beside him and was a model of composure. His voice was firm, a stark contrast to the turmoil around him. "You remember what I told you to do, right? Then go ahead." Brat's face contorted with worry, his eyes reflecting the seriousness of the situation. "Kim, what about you?" he shouted, panic for his comrade's safety audible in his voice. Kim, ignoring the pandemonium, replied simply, "Me?" His equanimity was as disarming as it was reassuring. Staring sternly at his unseen opponents, Kim cut through the air with determination and steadfastness. "I'll get rid of those bastards and be by your side." His words were not just a promise, but a harbinger of the storm he was about to unleash, an assurance that he would follow his brother as soon as the immediate threat was neutralized. A lone figure towered above the deserted streets against the panorama of the besieged city. There was a sense of the calm before the storm in his words, as he explained the gravity of their situation. The unappreciated breach of the gate, which was now revealed to be Aranga, threatened a disaster which no reinforcements could solve, for all able hands were busy with dungeons and chasms elsewhere. The moment of reckoning came when the figure at the window, the organizer of their defenses, proclaimed a grim decision. The only way out of this situation, he paused, and in the silence that ensued the gravity of the impending decision became apparent, is to awaken the A-Rang. The tension in the room was palpable, a mixture of hope and despair hanging in the air as the figure turned and addressed the man directly. "You are our only hope." The urgency of his tone left no doubt. The mantle of salvation now rested entirely on this guy's shoulders. In the bright light, the marks of many battles were visible on An Hyunsu's face, and his eyes testified to the warrior spirit embedded in him. The title, Awakened Rank A, was not just a title, but a badge of honor, a symbol of the power he possessed. The blade of lunatism, a beacon in the darkest hour. As the fate of the city stood on the edge of the abyss, Hyunsu's eyes glistened with unshed tears, but not from fear, but from determination. "Hero, I, An Hyunsu, am coming," he proclaimed, and his voice rumbled through the night. It wasn't just an oath, it was the call of a guardian ready to protect his ward from the encroaching darkness. The hero had risen, and with him a sliver of hope. Following the cataclysm that tore through the sky, a monstrous beast of heads swept through with a defiant roar. Its red eyes blazed with anger, piercing through the shroud of dust and debris. A fierce power swirled around him, either from his essence or thrown at him by an unseen foe. The air crackled with unbridled ferocity, foreshadowing a battle of epic proportions. On the battlefield, facing the Colossus, with his back to the world, stood Kim. A monstrous figure towered above him, silhouetted against the menacing sky. But for Kim, it was just another battle, and he was actively beating all these creatures. The once formidable Leviathan was defeated, its huge figure sprawled across the devastated landscape. The aftermath of the conqueror's devastating onslaught could be seen from above. The creature's eyes, once glowing with a wild light, were now dimmed, and its huge body bore witness to the fierce battle. Amidst the ruins, Kim continued the battle, the expression on his face an enigma of calm amidst the chaos. The world around him was ablaze with the effects of destruction, but he stood unharmed, his gaze firm and confident. His calmness in the face of such turmoil spoke of confidence, of predicted battles and carefully considered strategies. He was the eye of the storm, the architect of the creature's doom, a warrior whose foresight was as deadly as the sword he wielded. And as the dust settled on the ruined city, its story was just beginning to unfold. In a realm where arcane mana flows dictated the ebb and flow of power, he was spending too much mana to win against monsters. An ethereal light emanated from his skin, merging into a bright blue glow that danced around his fingers. The symbols of a bygone language appeared and disappeared, outlining the contours of his hand, a testament to the mastery of the mystical essence of mana. Power, however, had to be paid for. In the next instant, it was clear what such power led to. A scarlet cross, the universal sign of prohibition, appeared on the hand, and the figure to whom it belonged became hunched and burdened. Ghostly arrows flew downward, further emphasizing how much of the wearer's life force was being drained away. Strength drained from the limbs, as if the very act of summoning the skill was taking away part of their essence, chaining the body like an anchor to the ground plane. Amidst the fallen monsters, a revelation struck him. By absorbing the essence of the defeated, one can replenish mana reserves. The dark possibility is a path rife with ethical issues, a seductive road fraught with danger. Amidst the darkness, Kim's Cheshire grin erupted. The symbols returned to orbit, becoming more aggressive, as if to reflect the growing boldness of their master. The power he possessed was no mere focus of light, but a profound transformation that promised incalculable possibilities. On the battlefield, beneath a purple sky, rose Kim, whose form had hardened in recent trials. Above him, the very air itself seemed to split, forming a cloying void that signified a new echelon of abilities. Predation and Stone Skin appeared, signifying not mere survival, but a thriving soul in the midst of chaos. It was an evolution visible to the naked eye, a power that could not be denied or hidden. In another reality, the silhouette stood against the backdrop of outer space and held a silent conversation about what was and what could be. The upper form was a beacon of control and hidden power, a vessel ready to be filled. The lower form was the opposite, eyes burning with ambition, contrasting sharply with an ethereal calm. The narrative whispered of a meteoric ascent, a trajectory capable of elevating the seeker into the echelons of the S rank, or even the mythical SS rank. Finally, Kim stood alone, surrounded by the wreckage of conquest. The silence spoke volumes, only the character's internal deliberation of further action. Blood and shadows were his witnesses, silent spectators of a journey that was far from over. The decision loomed like another page of a book eager to be turned, and the fate of Huang Jie, and perhaps the entire world, hung in the balance. Under the pale light of the moon, the air shook with otherworldly energy, casting long shadows on the deserted street. Kim stood motionless, eyes fixed on the unseen horizon. His face, half hidden by the darkness, was a mask of reflection. He heard some strange sounds. But after all, he had already killed them all. Without warning, the calm was shattered. A colossal monster, grotesque and imposing, descended from the heavens, or perhaps rose from the abyss. Kim turned and lunged toward the Leviathan, which seemed intent on crushing him and everything in its path. The air crackled with tension, and Am's voice rattled over the battlefield. "You filthy monster!" he roared, and his words became a blade of pure vengeance. The creature, with its face contorted with a vicious grin, seemed to recoil. Its very essence was called into question by the force of Am's conviction. With the golden blade, he threw himself directly at this monster. With a warrior's declaration, Amma proclaimed himself the bringer of justice. His voice pierced the night. "This warrior of justice, Amma, will judge you," he proclaimed. His silhouette, illuminated by the intermittent glow of the city, was a beacon of defiance, the power of his creed glowing in himself. But after his bold declaration, uncertainty crept into his soul. For a moment, hesitation flashed across Kim's face, and his resolve wavered as his mind clouded. He didn't expect there were any monsters left, and who else was even fighting them besides him? At the climax of their cataclysmic encounter, the monster loomed like a titan of darkness, writhing in the grip of Amma's newfound power. From above was a view of imminent triumph. The ferocity of the monster paled before the brilliance of Amma's attacks. Light whipped like a spear, cutting through shadow and fear, promising an end to the nightmare. In the silence after the tumultuous battle, Kim stood among the rubble, his silhouette standing out against the starry sky and the jagged crystals that rose like monuments to the great battle. The echo of power still rumbled in the air, and the traces of the battle gradually faded from the surrounding world. As he surveyed the damage done, it hit him. He had fought a rank A monster, a monster from nightmares, and remained unharmed. An inner whisper of awe at his own might, unanticipated but undeniable, rushed through his mind. He easily defeated an A-rank monster. The thought was both delightful and burdensome at the same time, and the title of Awakened Rank A was a mantle burdened with expectation. The Blade of Lunatism, as it was called, stood before Kim. Around them, the ruined city watched their encounter in silence. Yet despite the seriousness of his act, a smirk appeared on Anna's face, and his words were a mockery of the defeated man. "Idiotic monster. He died at the hands of my sword of justice." It was a victory cry that permeated the darkness of the night, but the plot thickened when Kim appeared out of the shadows with a mute question on her lips. "Why is An Hyunsu here?" That question hung in the air like some nondescript piece of a puzzle, adding new layers to the puzzle. Suddenly, the Silent Slayer's facade cracked, revealing a solemn reverence beneath the warrior's outward appearance. Bowing his head and clasping his hands together, he offered a silent prayer for the townspeople, a moment of peace amidst the chaos. It was a poignant reminder that people's lives are intertwined with his own, those invisible faces for whom he holds his sword. But, as all warriors know, peace is a fleeting gift. Kim's eyes widened as he sensed the approaching force. It was done on instincts honed in countless battles. The air around him shrank, and the night held its breath. Skill detected. In the dim light of twilight, An Hyunsu was suddenly ambushed. An unseen force had struck a vicious blow. Instinctively, he threw his hands up, forming a barrier in a futile attempt to repel the attack. Blood spurted from his wounds, coloring the air with a vivid reminder of his mortality. The hero that had just so exalted himself was defeated. The impact caused him to stagger, the taste of iron in his mouth, and he staggered backwards. "What?" he gasped, words tumbling from his lips in pain and disbelief. He had been a hunter, a silent blade in the night. And now, wounded and vulnerable, he was struggling to cope with a shocking twist of fate. And then the architect of his doom appeared out of the shadows. A figure shrouded in mystery appeared before him, its presence both ethereal and ominous. "I've caught you, An Hyunsu," the figure announced, its voice a cold whisper that cut through the silence. A sinister smile played across its features, a glimmer of victory. Or was it malice? And the predator of the night, the blade of lunatism, had become prey. Trapped by a creature as formidable as darkness itself, in the dim light of the hospital room, Brother Kim stood silently at the foot of the bed, staring at the motionless figure of Ms. Choi, the school nurse. Her serene expression did not reflect the gravity of the situation. She lay silently testifying to the chaos that had unfolded that day. The scene shifted closer, and Ms. Choi's calm facial features now came into focus. Despite the chaos around her, she appeared calm. Suddenly, the narrative took a personal turn as Brother's inner turmoil surfaced. Is this really normal? He pondered, and the doubt was evident in his furrowed brow and beads of sweat on his forehead. He questioned the silence, the inaction, the very fabric of reality that had led to this moment. As the horror of the impending night crept into Brother's thoughts, the story grew deeper. A lot of people are going to die tonight, he whispered to himself, and his voice trembled faintly in the silence of the room. The memory of Kim's words that he had to protect the nurse at all costs, and he had done so, popped into his mind. Because she was the kind of person who would not give up and save herself. Her body language spoke of a fierce determination to stand her ground, putting the lives of others before her own safety. She will die if she concentrates on helping rather than evacuating. So Kim was right that she should be rescued at all costs. Also, in his memories were Kim's words about using his power of sedation. So the doctor would not be on the scene, and Brother would just have to follow her and do his best to keep her from finding out about the horrible events in the city. Kim's words that this mission is more responsible than saving the world also come out of his memory, and his brother must take it with all responsibility. Standing in the room above the nurse, he didn't understand how Kim knew all this. He couldn't imagine that he could really know the future. It was a contradiction of reality, and a complete contradiction. This thought disturbed him most of all. Even though all the events that took place outside the confines of this cozy room, here the nurse began to come to her senses after a long sleep. She was trying to understand where she was and what was happening to her at all. Her brother began to tell her not to get up, because she had supposedly lost consciousness, and it would be better just to lie on the bed until she came to her senses. And then it occurred to his brother like an epiphany how Kim knew everything. It's the power of prediction, of course. He had awakened that power within himself, but his thoughts shattered like a crystal glass, a thought Kim had refuted the first time he met them. If he had had this gift, he would have predicted the arrival of the robbers, rather than them catching him out of the blue. But don't forget the main plot. The full moon made it even more suspenseful as Friday the 13th. Kim watched as his savior was cut to pieces. It was a shame he couldn't interact with him, but at the same time, a smirk of possibility lurked within him to absorb his powers. In his mind was the idea of helping his savior. But at the same time, why waste his time on all of this if he could just watch from the sidelines of this interesting battle? An was facing his death, holding his wound. He only cared about one thing: to find out who his opponent was that attacked him from behind like a sneak. So he shouted for the one to give his name. His opponent began to take off his magic shield and laugh, saying that it was strange that he didn't recognize him because they had met before, and as he had promised, he had come for revenge. His sinister smile spread across his face. He had waited so long for this meeting, to hear finally set up this amusing hunt. As An had once staged on him, he called himself villains. That's exactly what he called himself. He breeds chaos, and that's exactly the kind of madman An has been chasing with his blade of justice for so long. Oh, and of course he thought he could beat him. Kim watched this ironic meeting of two old acquaintances, but he was merely in the form of an observer. It was not his battle to intervene without needing to do so. He just didn't understand. If An defeated this guy, how was he able to resurrect again? Did the future change because of his teleportation, or is there something different? An looked at villains with all the anger he could muster. He realized that this freak was the spawn of hell, and that he should die just as he did then. And on the whole, there was no way in which his appearance could have happened. With his last strength, he revived his sword of justice and swung straight at his worst enemy. He was ready to give his life to finally defeat this freak. There was more anger and hatred in his face than the feelings of pain he had from the wound his opponent had inflicted. With blood dripping down his face, he trotted into battle with his enemy. With a swing of his sword, the ground began to tremble. Again began to rise the storm of events that had recently just subsided. But this is a battle with only one winner. But this moment was shattered by the sudden appearance of a giant from under the ground. An and his enemy were already flying into the abyss, trying to hold on to the air to avoid being crushed by the unexpected turn of events. The huge ogre began to roar. This roar made the entire windows shake, and the air was overflowing with lightning that appeared in the process of the appearance of this huge creature. Am couldn't believe how this was possible. He had killed it, and now this ogre is awake again, making a fuss like nothing happened. Something's not right here. The giant's aggression became more and more apparent with each passing second. He swung his huge arm to strike directly at Anu, but he managed to dodge, and the blow went straight into the ground. The ground shook from the force of the blow. Villains in this situation was luckier. He was able to dodge the blow, so he got off a small scratch, and the fate of Anna is still a mystery. Villains turns his head and can't believe what he sees. He looks at Kim and tells him that it is not good to be a free spectator of such an interesting performance and he must pay with his life. He lunges straight at Kim to blow his head off with his katana, while shouting that it's a very good thing that there will be one more victim. That makes him obsolete. Kim focused his gaze on his attacker. He didn't expect to be paid attention to at all. After all, these guys had their own idea and the solution to their conflict was purely between them. Nivilian thought otherwise, and was already rushing towards Kim with his tongue out of his mouth. He was thirsty for new blood, for something as fresh as Kim's. In a second, the blade of the Neolans came close to Kim's neck, but at the same moment a stony growth, one of Kim's abilities, appeared on the place where the blow was to come. Without taking his hands out of his pocket, Kim swung his legs at his enemy's face. He was thrown backwards. He obviously didn't expect anyone to resist him in such a situation. As he regrouped, he could think that this fight would not be so simple, and that his opponents were Kim, who had already been awakened and possessed a rather uncomplicated power. But why does he possess the power to change his body? After all, it's rank B, and according to Kim's stats, he's only rank C. Kim wasn't happy that he was attacked, but he said that it would be more interesting to master the new power. At least it would be honestly earned in battle. So he began to cover his whole body with a growth to fight his enemy, taunting him and beckoning him to finally start attacking instead of just standing there staring at him stunned. Vilansa succumbed to such provocation, so he rather rushed towards Kim to kill this cocky, low-ranked guy with the power of a higher rank without a second thought. At the same moment, Kim was grouping up to shield the blow of his attacker. He was confident of his victory, so he was ready for any attack from his opponent. And now the blade is already flying towards Kim. To shield his blow, he puts his hand as a block, so that all the force of the blow came to it. Another battle began between them. The only difference between them was that the opponent was of a much higher rank than Kim, and the fight could turn not to Kim's side in such a situation. The opponent was surprised at Kim's capabilities, that he wasn't fighting the battle as a beginner, but as an experienced warrior. This fueled in him even more interest in victory. He also added that he didn't know that he would use such powers, so it felt good to fight him, compared to Anne, who was just in on his idea about the Holy Blade of Justice EPUB. A conversation ensued between the two, while in the background Ann's battle with the huge monster that he was supposed to be killing went on. Vilansa turned to Kim with the idea that he was just a kid who fancied himself a hero. Too bad he'd have to kill a talent like him. He could have chosen the right side in this battle because his world would fall apart. He looked at Kim with an angry look, saying that he didn't know what was important, and that his idea of victory is meaningless because he's about to die from his hidden power.